William Tett, former Minister Betty Tett's son, has today been sentenced to death by a Nairobi court. He was found guilty of robbing his father, also called William Tett, of credit.
In April 2022, inside Kamiti Maximum Security Prison, a man stood quietly, holding a phone. On the other end, a stranger listened. The voice sounded foreign, calm, polished, convincing. "I'm actually in Lodwar, heading towards South Sudan," he says.
Oh, you're in Nairobi. Myself, I'm actually in a place called Lodwar. In an area, yeah, I'm in Lodwar town. You know Lodwar town? Okay, we're actually on the border towards going to Southern Sudan.
It sounded real, like a man calling from far away, someone educated, someone you could trust. But it wasn't real, because that call was coming from inside a prison cell, and the man speaking was not a traveler, not a businessman, and not a foreigner. He was a convicted robber, a man who had once walked into his parents' home with armed men and turned it into a crime scene, a man who had tied up his own father and demanded millions. His name was David William Tett, also known as Billy. To some, he was a child rescued from tragedy, adopted by his aunt, raised in privilege, given everything. But to others, he was something else entirely, a planner, a manipulator, a man who didn't stop, even after prison. So how does a life begin with rescue and end in betrayal, when a son turns against his own family? And why would the adopted son of Betty Tett and her husband William Mulrooney walk into their home not as a son, but as a robber? This is Dark Hour Docs. Welcome. David's story didn't begin with crime. It began with loss. At just 1 year old, he lost his mother, leaving him without parental care and with an uncertain future ahead. For a time, that future remained unclear, fragile, and without direction until someone stepped up. A decision to take him in was taken by Betty Tett, his mother's sister, together with her husband, William Mulrooney Tett. Betty served as an assistant minister for local government and an assistant minister for housing. They didn't treat him as an outsider or a responsibility. They raised him as their own son by giving him a home, an identity, and a second chance at life. He became Billy, the last born in a family that could provide opportunities many could only dream of. Just like any other politician kids in Kenya, he went to good international schools, lived in comfort, and grew up in an environment where struggle was distant and poverty was something you only saw from afar. From the outside, everything seemed set. His path looked secure, his future almost guaranteed. But somewhere along the way, something began to change. As he grew older, the bond between him and his adoptive family slowly weakened. What once felt stable began to show cracks. By his teenage years, his life had started to drift off course. This was highly influenced by the decisions he ended up making and their impact on his relationship with his parents. At just 17 years old, David had gotten a girl pregnant, a mistake that came with consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The weight of it all became too much to face, so David dropped out of school and disappeared, which left his parents disappointed. He ran from home, leaving behind not just his education, but the life that had once been carefully laid out for him. His adoptive parents were left devastated, searching, hoping, but never finding where he had gone. Unsurprisingly, the life that David had earlier known began to slip away as he was now far away from the opportunities he had been provided with. As he would soon find out, the world out there was different. It was harsh, unpredictable, and far less forgiving. For years, he struggled to find his footing, facing life on his own and learning lessons the hard way. And over time, that distance from his family and his past only grew deeper. Until one day, he returned back home. And as a chance to start over, his father gave him 70,000 shillings. For the dad, this was a chance to make things right. But to David, this was just a small lifeline and nothing of significance from people he believed were very loaded. So he left again. The money was quickly used up and there was nothing to show for it. With nowhere else to turn, he went back home again for yet another time, this time asking for more. He hoped, maybe, for something bigger, something that could change everything. He wanted land, a piece he could sell, a shortcut to the life he felt he deserved. But this time, his father said no, an answer that was firm and final, and which would result in something shifting inside David. The rejection didn't feel like guidance, it felt personal. In his mind, it wasn't just a refusal, it was proof. Proof that he didn't truly belong, and that he was different. He felt like an outsider in a family he once called his own. And the next time he would come back, he would come frustrated and disappointed with his own family, and something darker slowly taking shape in him. Because sometimes, it's not where a story begins that defines it, but where it turns. By the beginning of September 2011, something had clearly changed in how David thought and saw his parents. This was no longer the same young man who had once been welcomed back into the family home. This time, he was coming with a plan. Rob his parents, unalive them, and blame it all on carjackers if successful. On September 6, 2011, at around 1 p.m., residents of the posh neighborhood of Karen were preparing lunch, and the day looked normal on the surface. But that calm was about to be broken. A few hours earlier, at around 11:30 a.m., David had picked up some goons, where he would later say he was carjacked. He then drove them towards their home in Karen. His mission was to get rich and go missing. David then arrived at the gate of the home belonging to Betty Tett and her husband, William Mulready, who had been his guardians. He was not alone, but was accompanied by 2 other men in a vehicle with Ugandan number plates. To everyone in the vicinity, nothing looked unusual. In fact, he was recognized as the son of the house, as the lastborn, and as Billy. The housemaid, Christine, did not recognize David as she was a new employee. She, however, allowed them inside the house after David pointed at a picture on the wall and told her it was him. Inside the house, everything moved normally at first. The visitors were welcomed in, and David waited calmly as his father was called to meet him. When William Mulready arrived downstairs, he did not see danger. He saw his son. But what followed was not a reunion, it was the beginning of a robbery. David and his father stepped outside for what seemed like a private conversation. At first, it was about money, specifically a loan of 70,000 shillings that had not been repaid by David. But the conversation quickly shifted. Voices rose, tension built, and what began as a disagreement turned into something far more serious. Inside the house, his accomplices had already taken control. One of them pulled a weapon on the househelp, forcing her to the ground as fear spread through the room. When David returned inside, he was no longer just a son in conflict with his father. He was now part of an operation. William was restrained, tied up, and overpowered as demands began: money, access, and control of the house. The demands escalated quickly, moving from hundreds of thousands to millions of shillings. And when William questioned why his own son was doing this, the answer was cold and direct. It was about land. It was about rejection. It was about anger that had been building over time. But outside the house, something else was happening. Betty Tett had begun to sense that something was wrong, as calls to her home were not being answered and staff were not responding. Silence had replaced routine. So she called and sent the security guard to check on the situation at the house. And when he arrived, the security guard was also pulled into the same trap, and his hands were tied alongside the house help and William Mulready. Having gotten no answer, Betty called the security guard again to see if he'd established contact with her husband, but the call went unanswered. This prompted her to call the police and ask them to go to her home. For David and his accomplices, their days were numbered. They were not aware that the alarm had already been raised and that police were on the way, and the plan that had been carefully executed was about to collapse. By the time the alarm finally reached the authorities, the situation inside the Karen home had already begun to spiral beyond control. What had started as a carefully calculated entry, quiet, deliberate, and precise, was now unraveling into something else. The house had been fully taken over and everyone restrained and taken as hostage. But outside the gates, police units were already closing in, responding to distress signals from the growing suspicion by Betty Tett. An alarm was triggered within the compound, and the fragile control they had maintained instantly collapsed into chaos. Inside, panic took over. With no time left to think, David ran, jumping into the same vehicle they had arrived in, speeding out of the compound with urgency, recklessness, and desperation guiding every move. But not everyone escaped. Utterly confused, two of his accomplices attempted to flee on foot, carrying guns as they ran toward the exit. Unfortunately, they didn't make it. Within seconds, gunshots rang out, and both men were fatally shot as officers moved swiftly to secure the scene and neutralize the threat. Inside the house, order was slowly restored. The hostages were freed, and the rooms were cleared. Weapons were recovered, phones were collected, and the full weight of what had just happened began to reveal itself. But David was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared into Nairobi traffic, vanishing with the getaway vehicle and leaving behind a trail of confusion, evidence, and unanswered questions. However, that disappearance wouldn't last long. With witness accounts, the dad's help, and critical details from the scene, investigators quickly began piecing together his identity. The same person who had once been welcomed into that home as a son was now being hunted as a fugitive. And then, in a move that stunned investigators, David walked into a police station on his own. But the story he told was not the story they had uncovered. He claimed that he had been kidnapped by armed men, forced into the robbery, and later abandoned it after a failed escape attempt. In his version, he was a victim of circumstances, but the evidence said otherwise. Witnesses placed him at the center of the operation, with some of the stolen items being found in his possession. The details simply did not align, and as the truth became clearer, within days, David William Tett was formally arrested and charged with robbery with violence. He was sentenced to life in prison as his mother watched, which was later reduced to 15 years. But even then, this was not the end of David's story, because prison did not stop him. It changed him. Years later, his name would surface again, this time not from a crime scene, but deep within the walls of Kamiti Maximum Security Prison. In April 2022, a scheme within the prison was unearthed, where mobile phones were being smuggled in, roles assigned, and systems created that resembled a call center. But instead of customer service, it was deception at scale. Thousands of messages were sent out, promising jobs, investments, opportunities, even love, crafted carefully to exploit hope, urgency, and trust. And when someone responded, the trap was already set. Money was lost, sometimes in small amounts, sometimes in devastating sums that changed lives overnight. David was at the center of the scheme, as he adapted using altered accents, shifting identities, and carefully constructed stories to gain trust from people who had no idea of the scheme.
Meet David Tett. His sentence was reduced from life to 15 years. He has mastered the art of the conning game. Here, he poses as a foreigner.
Oh, you're in Nairobi. Myself, I'm actually in a place called Lodwar. In an area, yeah, I'm in Lodwar town. You know Lodwar town? Okay, we're actually on the border towards going to southern Sudan.
And so it continues.
Yeah, how old are you? How old are you? You're 37. That is very nice. I'm actually 45 years old. So, I'm very, very happy. I thought maybe you're a schoolgirl or something, okay? Well, I'm happy. I pray to God. I'm a Christian. I've been praying to God, and I'm very happy, darling, all right?
For David, crime had not ended, but simply evolved. From a son once given a second chance, to a fugitive running from the consequences of his actions, to a voice hidden behind prison walls, still reaching into the lives of unsuspecting victims. And maybe the most unsettling part of it all is that even behind bars, the damage didn't stop. It simply found new ways to reach the outside world. And with that comes the end of David's uninspiring story. This has been Dark Hour Docs. Thanks for watching.